Welcome everyone this evening. Thank you so much for joining us for the second event in our new Atelier series of live events. Thank you so much to PS1 for hosting us tonight. This is such an important institution doing important work here in New York for artists globally. And I am very excited to say that PS1 very generously has agreed to have the galleries open this evening after our panel during the reception. So if you haven't yet had an opportunity to see the current exhibitions, I hope you avail yourself of that unique chance to explore the galleries. I will also say how grateful I am to be here. It's a bit of a homecoming for me. So 21 summers ago, I was a curatorial intern here at PS1 and also worked the door at Warm-Up and brought really great 2004 electroclash energy to PS1. I believe that sort of might be back in style for all I know right now. So we're just really thrilled to be here. For those of you who joined us at our inaugural Atelier at the Morgan Library in December, welcome back. For those of you for whom this is your first Atelier experience, I just want to explain that Atelier is a series of live panel discussions with some of the most influential voices, leaders in our field, talking about some of the most pressing topics of the day. I will say that this initiative reflects a larger investment that we are making at Artforum in having or creating spaces for conversation, for dialogue that is nuanced, that is historical, that is also generous and sort of in good faith, both in our live events and across all of our other platforms. It is also very important to me that the conversation is not just the panel up here, but that it spills over into the reception afterwards. There is a lot of wisdom and experience in this room, and what we want to do is essentially create space for those of us who have a lot of thoughts and are very invested in these topics, but may not ordinarily have the time to get together with our colleagues to talk about these kinds of things. So that is what we're here to do tonight. This particular topic was influenced by my conversation with Connie Butler, also by Eric Crosby's contribution to the current issue of Artforum, the May 2025 issue of Artforum, in which he tackles the idea of relevance as the metric by which museums should assess the work that they do and the way that they orient themselves to their communities. It also is inspired by, as Connie mentioned, PS1's current exhibition that Sheldon Gooch co-organized along with Blake Pascal from Visual Aids downstairs in dialogue with Visual Aids about visual aids, and that actually operates as a harm reduction site. And so thinking about the work that museums are doing to fill in for the attenuation of public services, in addition to the work that they've been doing over the past 5 years in radically reconsidering who their audiences are and how they engage them and communicate with them. And needless to say, we find, while this has been sort of a topic that has been of relevance for many years, in this particular moment in which so many of our really important cultural organizations have had their funding threatened by the Trump administration, it seems particularly urgent again to think about how vital museums are in their communities and the kind of work that they can and should be doing moving forward, and also how we can support them in that work. All right, so I will say, just as a final note, so quick run of show. So I've had my 5-minute introduction now. I will now introduce the speakers and then invite each of them to give their own 5-minute introduction to who they are and what they do, primarily through a very concrete example, which then will ground the conversation. And I really do believe that panel discussions should be discussions and not a series of 4 monologues. So we will have what I hope will be a very lively discussion speaking to each other. And then in lieu of having a Q&A, we're going to ask everyone to keep a mental note of all of their questions and comments, and then bring all of that to the reception afterwards so we can continue the conversation and open it up to all of us with some very delicious champagne. So without further ado, I'm going to begin by welcoming Eric Crosby, who is it's a long title, I'm going to say it all just to be very formal, the Henry J. Heinz II Director of the Carnegie Museum of Art and Vice President of Carnegie Museums of Pittsburgh. And of course, we're all very excited about the Carnegie International that will be mounted next year. And again, for those of you who haven't read Eric's contribution to the current issue, don't do it right now, but I hope you will be inspired to go take a look at it after this. Next, we have Herb Tam from the Museum of Chinese in America. So thank you so much, Herb, for being here. He is the director of exhibitions there since 2011. So much of the amazing work that they've been doing, we have Herb to thank for that. He is also co-founder of the Chinatown Basketball Club, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that later. And then last but not least, we have Sheldon Gooch, who's a curatorial assistant here at MoMA PS1. And as you've already heard, Sheldon co-organized the visual aids Homer presentation downstairs, and also has some amazing experience at other institutions as well. We were just speaking actually about your work in Illinois. So hopefully people will also bring to the stage their other experiences at other institutions as well. There's a lot of institutional memory and history up here on this stage. So if I can get a quick round of applause just for all of our speakers. And okay, Eric's on the clock, 5 minutes. You begin now.
Okay. Great, thank you, Tina. And thank you for the opportunity to write, and also to Jeff for that. And I've admired Rachel Wetzler's writing for some time, and now I admire her skills in editing. So thank you to Rachel on your team. She's right. I'm the director of the Carnegie Museum of Pittsburgh, Western Pennsylvania, and I function there as the chief curator of the museum, as well as a representative of a larger body of museums, a family of museums that also includes the Andy Warhol Museum. I've chosen here an image of a commission that the museum completed with the artist Andrea Geyer, a set of banners that festoon the interior space of the museum as it looks out onto the museum's central courtyard, a courtyard that had long been underutilized just as a kind of place for school groups to gather for lunch in an ad hoc way, but not in any way for programming. And in fact, the way that it had been used as a gallery for outdoor sculpture had kind of fallen in disrepair as well. The pandemic then prompted us to really think about how we can make use of our outdoor spaces with greater intention. And as part of that, and you'll read in the essay, as part of that, we're really trying to shift our thinking at the museum away from programs as meeting specific audience needs insofar as we project needs onto publics, and instead trying to embrace a spirit of resource sharing, cataloging what it is the museum as an institution has to offer, communicating that as clearly as possible to various constituent groups who may choose to make use of those resources and do so on their own terms. I find that we're at a really important inflection point in museum culture and discourse, and a lot of assumptions are being made that really need to be questioned. So this conversation doesn't have to be that rhetorical analysis, but the essay tries to do some of that work. For Andrea, one of her statements here, they all begin with the words "I want," at a moment when so many were saying what we need. Right? Andrea is turning it to the individual subject. I want a museum to be a space to breathe, breathing as a form of being. And if a museum is for breathing, which it is, we're all in a museum right now breathing, then we might just consider that we already have everything we need to enjoy the art within it. We might not need a museum to give us more. And when an institution speaks in the language of community, I always think about how it's expressing a desire to manifest form, right? Museums are in the business of making forms. This is a form, 4 chairs on a stage with lights, right? We got the form part down. But when a museum is also speaking the language of community, it's expressing a very direct resistance, and it's a resistance to the complexity of what is unformed or what is forming. And that, I think, is where we all should commit ourselves, not just intellectually, but with heart, in terms of how we look forward with the relevance of museums today, focusing on what's possible in the abundance of the unformed. So that's my example. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. I can't believe you fit all of that into 5 minutes. It's well done, and really thoughtful provocation. So now I will pass it along to Herb.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much. It's really amazing being here. I never really have the chance to reflect on what it means to work in a museum, except for, with my colleagues and other select people. So it's great to kind of do it under this kind of pressure of the lights and esteemed professionals next to me. And also just seeing friends, old friends I haven't seen in a while, Harley, seen Kadar, I think Echo is here from the Chinatown Basketball Club. And anyway, it's just really cool for me to be here. But I only have 4 slides, so don't worry. The museum where I work, it's called the Museum of Chinese in America. It's located in Chinatown. It was founded as a kind of documentation project of the neighborhood when it was changing very rapidly in the 80s, 70s and 80s. New immigrants were moving in. There's sort of displacement, dislocation happening, and the founders were really worried about that. They thought that they should be saving these artifacts of the neighborhood, like store signs being tossed out of laundry businesses, people's memories as they passed away. None of this was being cared for, collected, or sort of taken seriously, even by members of their own community. And so they decided to pick up these pieces of history, and then with the hope of donating them to a larger museum, like New York Historical Society, Museum of the City of New York. I think they had meetings with them. They didn't want these things. They said, this is not the history we're trying to document. And so they created this institution, which back then was called the New York Chinatown History Project. So that's kind of the short story of the museum. And it's gone through name changes. It's gone through a lot of fire in 2020. And then I've been there since 2011. I came to this as an artist, and I was just thinking about Eric's essay on relevance in museums, and as an artist, I think there are artists out here. My mentality going into curating was kind of the ideas that I have in my head. They're the most interesting, they're the most relevant, they're the most cool. And that's how I approached it in the beginning. But, working at the museum, I had to think about it differently, and sort of I've, I think, grown into this different idea and mentality and approach towards curating, which is more about kind of having my ear to the street, and identifying the kind of themes and histories and artworks that I think would be relevant, not just to me, but to a larger audience, the community, if you want to call it that, although I really dislike that word, and I think about that word in the same way you think about relevance. I think that word has really lost a lot of meaning. It has emptied out, and it's also, I think, used to sometimes exclude people instead of being inclusive. But anyway, so yeah, I see my role as more about connecting, more about trying to identify what people out there are interested in. And this is a good example. The images that are up now, and whoever's controlling the slides can just kind of run through it a little bit. So this is an exhibition called Magazine Fever, Gen X Asian American Periodicals. And it's a show that looks back at magazine work that was being done, created by Asian Americans in the 80s and 90s, Gen X. And I thought about this because, PS1, has been the site of the New York Art Book Fair, Printed Matter's great project, And there's been like just like this deepening, broadening interest in independent book publishing, in zines, in all kinds of like independent alternative press. And so for us, I was thinking about that kind of growing interest and how we could engage in that. And so that's how this magazine show came about, because, I know that there's a lot of this history I didn't know, even though I'm like a Gen Xer. I knew some of it, not all of it, and I know like younger, folks in doing work that we're doing, like didn't know anything about. A Magazine or Yolk, Giant Robot, and even like smaller publications. So this is an effort to tap in to what I thought was like relevant with artists and like young writers and just people in like our world of the museum, which is like sort of like the Asian American creative, artistic, and scholarly community. But it also kind of taps into like that initial thing of like thinking that what I care about is like still like the most interesting thing that that I should like pay attention to. You know what I mean? Maybe next slide. Okay, yeah. So Chinatown Basketball Club. There's a little maybe random seeming to you all, but it, to me, fits together in a way that makes a lot of sense to me. So this is something that my wife and I do, and I think she just walked in, Lou Jiang in the back. We both like love playing basketball. We did it growing up. Her in China, me in the Bay Area in California, and we just noticed that we had kind of stopped hooping for like a long time. 2019, and we decided to just get out there with other artists that like wanted to ball too. And turns out they lived in Chinatown, like I work in Chinatown. So it felt really natural to go out to Columbus Park and just play ball. Then the pandemic happened, and I think this is where like time, the sense of time during the pandemic really shifted so much, like our sense of what we could do in X number of hours. And Chinatown Basketball Club really grew in that moment of like this kind of malleable time. And we're like, let's just go out there every Sunday. We know that if we go out there and there's like a good open spirit and, we hooped seriously and we kind of sometimes incorporated art and like aesthetics into it, that it could grow in a really interesting way that would be fun and would be very different than like basketball spaces that we're used to, which are like often in New York, like very aggressive and toxic. And so there's a space where we just like, hoop and sometimes think of art things to do. And it's in Chinatown, and it's like a different way for me to relate to the neighborhood. And this was taken like just yesterday. We had like a whole day of so many things that if I told you about all of them, then I would run well out of time. And like, you would never invite me back to another panel. So I'm gonna stop there and then like, that's it.
Thank you, Herb. I mean, I will say just briefly to your comment about the things that you're interested in being of interest to you, right? And building from there. One of my mentors when I was a museum curator was very emphatic about the point that we should not forget in all of our conversations about all of the various communities and constituencies that we present exhibitions for, that artists are also our audience. So.
Yeah, maybe I'll touch on that a little more later. But again, thank you, Tina, for bringing us here together today. I'm excited to be here to chat with Eric and Herb further. So I recently co-organized an exhibition that we see on the screen behind us in collaboration with Visual Aids and my colleague Blake Pascal. And the show is called Love Rules, the Harm Reduction Archives of Heather Edney and Richard Berkowitz. But before maybe getting into the show, I'll provide some more background context and info regarding the space that it is in, that Connie introduced so well downstairs, which is Homeroom. And this is a space and an initiative, a programming space that began in 2021 as a space that amplifies and celebrates the voices of artists, collectives, community organizations, and more particularly in New York, and even more so, Queens-based organizations. And it's a space for participatory engagement and the exploration of ideas encountered here at PS1, and particularly in context of its history as a site for learning, being we are in an old school building here. And the program has long been stewarded by my colleague, Assistant Curator Elena Kettleson-Gonzalez, who for the last 5 years has worked with a number of organizations within New York, around more than 10 organizations focusing on pressing issues regarding trans liberation, prison abolition, and migration. And these issues really have really served as sort of a way to be deeply, deeply engaged with many of the issues that sometimes we are afraid to talk about in a professional context, and to allow those communities who know the most about those issues to come in and speak up and to really amplify those voices. Recently, we opened an adjoining space to Homeroom called Classroom, which on the weekend serves as a public site for self-guided art making projects for people of all ages. But during the week, it serves as a private space actually for designated community partners to meet and use as they see fit. Most recently, the Long Island City-based organization, the Fortune Society, was in residence in the space, making new work in anticipation for their second exhibition in Homeroom, which focused on sort of creative reimaginings of the reentry process after incarceration. And in speaking to the Fortune Society's 2 shows that have since happened in Homeroom, I think that really sort of highlights the main intention of Homeroom, which is to sustain these relationships over time with these community organizations. And so Visual Aids actually was our inaugural partner in the Homeroom space in 2021, where they, in collaboration with an artist collective known as What Would an HIV Doula Do, presented and premiered a new zine that touched on the health education and harm reduction themes that were running concurrently in the Greg Bordowitz show that was up here at PS1 at the time. And ever since, Visual Aids has returned annually for their Love Positive Women project, which uses Valentine's Day as a backdrop for a series of events for sort of private and public displays of love for women living with HIV. And at PS1, they exhibit yearly the hundreds of handmade Valentine's Day cards that are then mailed out after exhibition to women living with HIV in time for February 14th. And so to return to the exhibition that is currently on view downstairs, the exhibition really centers the archives of Heather Edney and Richard Berkowitz. And these archives really sort of detail and set the backdrop for thinking through and the history, particularly of the early development of safer injection drug use practices and safe sex in the development of safe sex guidelines in the latter 20th century, of course, like the 90s into the early 2000s, and even as far back as the 80s. And the show really sort of centers the expertise of sex workers and drug users, people who are too often demonized for their use of drugs or their engagement in sexual activity, particularly in context of the still ongoing AIDS epidemic and drug-related overdoses. But rather than maybe approach this history in a sort of traditional chronological context, I think the show really sort of underscores, and I hope really underscores and highlights the camaraderie and the intimacy that has historically fueled this work amongst communities, particularly at a time in which they have been demonized vehemently. And so I really hope that with this show, particularly that highlighting those efforts really sort of helps to set these archives and this history as a blueprint for organizing today, particularly in a realm with sort of heightened widespread stigma and institutional neglect. So yeah, thanks.
So I'm hoping now that everyone understands why these 3 people were brought together this evening. And I mean, there are many other people who I also want to welcome into this conversation, but I think it was really important that we have, smart, impassioned people who work at 3 very different organizations in terms of the scales in which you operate, in terms of the audiences that you serve and engage with, in terms of the neighborhoods in which you're located, in terms of the kinds of exhibitions, that you present. And so I think I just want to begin by asking a question that is both incredibly basic and also potentially really thorny, which is, if we're here to talk about museums and how museums engage with their communities, various audiences, constituencies, however you want to define them, and perhaps we can even talk about those different terms and the meaning that's inherent in each of them, how do you know who they are, right? Like, how do you even define who your audience is, who your community is? How do you begin to do the work of imagining, right, and then connecting with them? And I want to ask this question sort of in two senses, right? Like, who are your audiences, but also, like, how do you figure out who your audiences are? Like, who gets to decide? Who are in, like, literally, who is in the room for those discussions, right? And what does that work look like as you iterate and grow and evolve, right, over the course of an institution's history?
Eric, you should start. I got too many thoughts in my head.
I was
about
going
that.
to pick up where you mentioned the sort of, I don't know if you said the word pernicious, that's the word in my head, about the use of the word community as something that institutions use to describe others and maybe exclude even others. And I do think that just in general practice now, when we talk about audience in our staff meetings and when we talk about quote unquote engaging communities, I think we are trying to resist the temptation to bring assumptions to that table and instead explore other ways of having others identify communities for us through partnership, like a deep partnership enriched programs. So we have a program called Neighborhood Museum, which is a series of partnerships with refugee resettlement agencies in and around the Pittsburgh area. And we work with them to engage their constituents. They bring their self-forming public to the museum. It's not a public program. These programs happen through the partnership. They're not advertised as such. And so in many ways, the most meaningful programs we're developing right now are those that have the smallest audiences because they're helping us to reframe how we think about how a public forms within a museum. And I use public as a word that's very intentionally not community because a public can be a public of one. It can be self-forming it's like me and my mom when I go to a museum, right? There are various publics and not all of their concerns and interests need to be rendered visible, nor do they want necessarily them to be rendered visible and or amplified. So at Neighborhood Museum, folks come, they learn about this resource that's within their new home city. They learn about the neighbors who are educators and the other public that is enjoying the museum. They connect with the artistic resources that are down the street from them, and hopefully they share a little bit about where they're coming from that makes the museum as dynamic and rich a place as it is, international place as it is. So I guess the answer is just like stop assuming you know who your audience is, stop assuming you know who your community is, and start talking to others who are more deeply involved. There's nobody on staff at anyone's museum who has deep expertise in defining communities, so why would we ask museums to do that work?
I mean, following up on that, I do think your question there to Herb is right, which is you've already objected to the use of the term community, and if we could hear more about that.
I'll talk about community, but let me just first say that I think when I think of like the audiences for the museum, I think about the people who actually show up sort of constantly. Because there's a lot of in the museum, there's a lot of just internal discussion about, who does our audience, who do we want to draw to the museum that's not coming, and this kind of imaginary group that you're constantly chasing. And, I always try to think about the people who are, always there and who clearly want the museum to reflect their experiences. And to me, that's like the most, I guess, the audience I prioritize the most. Because there are others who come and they just want to see the current exhibition because their friends in it, or they want to like learn about the history, but they don't need it to like reflect them. But there are some people who are like, this place is like a home base for my spiritual and cultural identity, and like that to me, that's like the most important kind of person to like reach. And then community is it's just something that I feel like we use in the museum too. It's another word that I found is a default kind of word that when people don't know what else to say about the people that they're like, that they might call audiences or stakeholders or a neighborhood, that they'll use community. And I think within like the people that we talk to a lot, it's used to kind of it's like a shorthand way of saying like, oh, we know what a lot of people want, and you're not doing it. You, the museum, are not doing it. Like, we know what the community wants, and you're not it, because you're not the community, this kind of vibe. And it's just something that I feel like is how people talk about it sometimes, with me, or just in sort of the conversations that kind of boil around the museum. So yeah, that's why when I sometimes feel it, like I feel the urge or the word kind of coming up and like towards my like tongue, I'm like, wait, let me just like think about a different, like, let me go to thesaurus.com of my head and like think of a different, more specific, word. Like, is it the people of Chinatown? Is it like, working class people in Chinatown? Is it, people in Columbus Park? What is it like that we're trying to get at? Or what is it that I'm trying to get at when I kind of, lump people into one, word? So it's just where like semantics is important in museums, and I think your essay
It's so important.
points out like how much like falling back on these terms like indicates a certain kind of like staticness of the work.
So for instance, the one group of people that museums don't use the word community to describe are the people who work at them. They call them workforces or colleagues, but it's actually a community of learners. And that's, just changing that language actually does shift the dynamic between people on the floor and in the hallway and in meetings. And I just think that's super valuable. And bringing people along and how that language is, how that museum speak gets rewritten is very important.
And to think of language, I like the term that you used earlier, Eric, the self-forming community or public. So yes, here at PS1, we sort of maybe have identified an interdepartmental groups, a general audience of artist communities or Western Queens and North Brooklyn. But really, I think that the sort of density of community that really begins to coalesce is in everybody that those people bring, those people and all of their sort of connections and their networks and their families and friends that join them here at PS1 for programs and for exhibitions, like programming, whatever it may be. And I think you really know that the community is certainly sort of coalescing and cementing itself when, the young child and his parents that you see at an art making program is also at warm up in the summer dancing, right? And they're coming back for different sorts of programs, and there's sort of a cross-pollination of engagement with the institution from those audiences. And so that idea of the self-forming public that knows what they want to see and goes and chooses those things, and really it's an exchange of trust between that public and us as an institution for that audience to sort of form on its own, as long as we're kind of doing our job correctly.
Right, and every partner organization brings its own public to the partnership, right? And it's about how the museum opts to receive that public or not, or just assumes it's theirs to consume. Like, well, okay, now you're on our mailing list, instead of like trying to meet them where they, like, what are their specific needs and interests that are driving their activity in this mutually beneficial partnership, instead of just assuming now they're tapped into the MoMA PS1 community. Yeah.
I mean, it strikes me, I mean, the word trust has come up a couple times now, and trust is a function of familiarity. I mean, I think it's really hard to inculcate trust with somebody who only has one encounter experience with you as an organization, right? So, I mean, this leads me into my next question, which is about engagement, right? I mean, because what you're talking about is cultivating relationships with people over time, repeat visitation. So, yeah, I mean, does that drive, right, to develop relationships with people over time inform the work that you do as an institution? I mean, as, a chief curator, as a director, right? I mean, how does this, yeah, I mean.
Yeah, I think, it comes down to language. If the word engagement is all that we're relying on, then we have an impoverished vocabulary to describe something that's inherently much more complex. Relationships are deeply complex. All of our relationships in the world are very complex. And so through the work of program development at Carnegie Museum of Art, instead of always falling back on this undefinable word of engagement, which is rooted in engagement psychology and is like basically designed to measure attention spans, right? That's not what we're talking. We're not talking about attention spans, like how long one looks at a painting. We're talking about human relationships, and so we've really begun to embrace the discourse of human flourishing as a psychological, as an interdisciplinary discipline rooted in psychology and philosophy that measures states of well-being, that considers positive social functioning as a primary outcome of museum activities, that foregrounds meaning and purpose and personal growth, right? And so, yeah, you can measure these things. We've done studies, we've done a study with UPenn that shows when people come to the museum and when they leave, there's measurable increases in those. I mean, but that's all aside. Anecdotally, it's much more interesting to begin to address people at the level of human flourishing than it is oh, did you feel engaged enough to read a wall label? I was on LinkedIn, I'll just say one thing. I was on LinkedIn and reading some really unfortunate piece of text that was about, the person was asking, how can we make our visitors want to read labels? And my answer is, why would we make them want to do anything, right? Why don't we just allow the complexity of their experience and their relationships unfold in the presence of art?
Do you guys know that meme that's about how if you exposed a small Victorian child to this music, it would immediately blow their minds? I feel like if we exposed a museum director from 50 years ago to what you just said about the language of human flourishing, their minds would explode. So my question is, let's say we co-sign everything you just said, right? How do all of those objectives then interface with the sort of traditional mission statement of an art museum, right? Given that, we presumably still believe that, I don't know, maybe it's not, maybe I shouldn't assume or presume. Maybe, I don't know, do we still think that museums, fundamentally or foundationally, are institutions that, conserve, collect cultural heritage for posterity, right? So, in terms of mission statement and orientation, in terms of how you prioritize your resources, right, and the work that your people do, how does human flourishing work? And this is a question for all of you, not just Eric, because I think we all I think we can say, we all want people to flourish, right? Especially in this economy. So how does that work, though, with the rest of the work that museums have to do?
Well, I had a question for Sheldon, along with that, because, the show you're doing, it's very, I saw it, and it's just great, the history I didn't, know about, and to see it in a place like this at PS1, I think is, really meaningful, because I think it's a kind of exhibition people wouldn't expect to see. But I'm curious about, what you want the visitor to kind of come away with in an exhibition like that, because, these are kinds of exhibitions we do a lot at the museum, these cultural histories. And I'm just curious, when in your head, what did you want the outcome to be for the visitor?
Yeah, again, I think really underscoring so much of that work that was happening, the harm reduction work that Heather was engaged in at the Santa Cruz Needle Exchange Program in the 90s, and Richard and writing How to Have Sex in an Epidemic, again, underscoring all of that were these relationships founded upon deep intimacy, loss, difficulties, trauma, failure, but also a sort of sustained love, and again, camaraderie and intimacy that I spoke to earlier. And in a time now that feels we all want to sort of resign ourselves to the despair of the current climate within the Trump administration amid larger sort of global issues. I think really what that show and what I want people to come away with this, and my colleague Blake wants people to come away from the exhibition with, is the understanding that even in sort of this darkness that we do have each other, we have the public, we have our friends or family. I want to evade the use of the word community, but we do have that, and at times it's inherent, and at other times it needs to be built in many different ways. And this show, I think, sort of sets a few models for how to build that, certainly. I think, though, also, now to your question about mission and community, and orientation particularly, I think I'm just thinking to PS1's own mission statement, which utilizes the term community-driven. And what I find interesting about that term is how it frames the orientation of the museum to the community. It's not something that is pulled in, but is something that, as being community-driven, the community pushes upon the museum in ways. And that happens both in the public and that happens in the private, whether that's in conversations regarding the development of programming. You know, I think of times in which museums have, that I've worked in former professional contexts and even current ones, in which we've made connections between artists and community partners that actually saw their shared themes quite differently and approached them quite differently, right? And a number of communications would happen, a number of conversations would happen, both in public and private, that would then culminate in a moment in which we realized as artists, as an institution, as community organizers, we all had to do things differently. And although that was all difficult at times, I think we can kind of think of that as a flourishing of these relationships and how they are supposed to operate, right, both in a positive and negative aspect.
Oh yeah, I'm really glad you said all that, because you know, I was thinking about, like, I was reading the El Museo del Barrio mission statement today, kind of in preparation for this. But, well, the two words I really liked were, they kind of like really emphasized, like, I think self-esteem and self-knowledge. And I thought that was really beautiful, because it's, you know, I think those are really good goals, I think, for like an ethnic-specific museum to have. And I was like, that's not anywhere in our like mission statement and you know, in our language and vocabulary. And I think it should, because I think it's very achievable. I feel like if you do shows about, you know, magazines that Asian Americans produce, like you might, and you see that, and it's done in a really respectful way and with like a sort of scholarly angle. And it's contextualized, then I feel like you could feel proud about that, that, you know, people like you did that. You could learn a lot about, you know, what it was like to be like a Gen X Asian American, you know, and like how self-representation worked back then, and the kind of like connection to how Gen X people, for example, thought about like institutions and whether they were something to like, you know, react against and strike down, or whether they're things you had to like work inside or outside of, for example. And you could feel like you could learn a lot from that and be proud of it. And I think like that those words are something that I'm like thinking about, you know, that we should try to have as goals too. Anyway, that's kind of what it made me think about when you were talking, Sheldon.
I'm
Well-
definitely a big fan of personal growth centered within mission statements, but I think the bigger problem with most of them is that they're like fundamentally production oriented, like Fordists, like we're creating this, we're doing that, right? It's all about these outputs.
Yeah.
And I think it's just valuable to like step back from the mission, like word salad, and to really think about what the value proposition of the organization is at any given moment. And right now, the value proposition we kind of work with is a confluence of creative possibilities. Like, that's it. Like, no one's making anything. We just have, like, these things are intersecting. The more confluence, the more possibilities there are, the more flourishing is possible. And that's just feels true to the moment. But value, I don't know
If I
if that resonates.
Yeah, certainly. But I also, if I could go back to this point about self-esteem and self-knowledge and maybe connect that to your question of what we would like people to maybe leave the show about Herb show with particularly, and that is that the knowledge to fight back to develop systems is all within us, and that, the sort of safe injection drug use practices and safer sex guidelines that are now, we can say, maybe ubiquitous among social services today, developed within the zines being passed around between drug users that they were telling each other the type of lighting to use under, setting guidelines such as not locking your doors when you're using so that somebody can get in just in case an overdose is to happen, right? That all began because of these personal experiences that resided with the sex workers, drug users, and still do to this day. And so that idea of trusting your partners and the audience to generate the knowledge that this is just about giving the space for that to flourish and not a sort of top-down sort of singular notion of us endowing knowledge or even sharing knowledge with another group. They're the ones sharing the knowledge and generating it. And I want people to leave the exhibition understanding that that can happen on both an individual and collective level.
Like empowerment.
Yeah,
I mean, for the sake of full disclosure, I just want to add that I actually refuse the terms of my own question. Like, if I was going to answer it myself, I think it's a false binary. So I was doing the job of, being moderator, but I think actually what you just said, Sheldon, reflects my own answer, which is that you have to have a sense of capaciousness about how we understand these terms, right? So, like, my idea of personal growth is capacious enough to include looking at a Van Gogh painting, and my idea of aesthetics is capacious enough to include a harm reduction workshop. Is where I would just sort of leave it at that. But all right, so I do have some more questions to get through, and nobody's flashing. We're still good? Great. Okay, perfect. I think I want to pivot for a second and talk about something that we've alluded to a little more concretely, which is how we understand the relationship between museums and their I almost said the C word. It was rising up like bile, and then I caught
Sorry,
it.
no, you can. No, don't say it. Just say it. Yeah,
No.
I trust you in using that word.
Yeah,
but
okay, well, I appreciate the
Don't
trust.
censor yourself.
We've developed it over time here. Publics, how we understand that changing, right? Like we sort of titled this panel with a nod to the year 2025, right? Making explicit, this is a conversation that has been going on, at least in museum circles, for a very long time. Part of what we wanted to do with this event was to open up that conversation to other people, to artists, to gallerists, to writers, et cetera, et cetera. But, if you look back, for example, the New Museums Museum as Hub initiative from like 2007 to 2016, I think developed a lot of the, conversation around thinking about the museum as a hub, as a community hub, as a resource center, thinking about all of the different ways that a museum can function within a network of people, right? It's a conversation that's been ongoing. Why are we having it again in 2025, right? And so the answer is because I think that, due to external pressures, sort of evolution or devolution of public discourse, cuts to public funding, we've already mentioned, right? This relationship is no doubt continuing to evolve, let's say, right, in real time. And I think it's probably changing now in ways that we don't fully recognize and are only beginning to anticipate, although maybe there's some among us who are real clairvoyants and like know which way the wind is blowing. But I'd just be really curious to hear from you guys about, either how you already see your thinking change in response to what's going on right now, or how you think things might change in the near future. And Sheldon, I don't know, I just realized I didn't ask you if it would be okay to talk about this, but I heard that actually the city has reached out to talk, do you know about this, to PS1 to talk about, is that something?
Yes, however, I was unfortunately not in that meeting at the moment.
But just to say, the work that, this show is doing is so important that it caught the eye of local government officials who are trying to figure out, and I hope this is okay to say, but are trying to figure out, right, how to partner with you guys about using you as a resource to advance their own community health initiatives, right? So, and frankly, that's heartening to hear that there's a governmental body that actually wants to invest in, community health and in harm reduction, especially for, marginalized or at-risk communities. So, any thoughts about where things are going?
Well, I would also add just one of the factors that's driving the conversation again is burnout on museum staff teams in particular. We know that 75% of millennial staff members in museums are not only just ready to leave their roles to go to another museum, they're just ready to leave the field. And this is a very alarming statistic, and I think it's because of the burnout caused by a lot of poor assumptions about how museums as public institutions are meant to interface with their constituents, with the public. And so I think that's why this moment calls for real reconsideration of the language and practice, right? And to involve those younger staff members in that conversation so that we're moving away from a top-down, my analyst, from a top-down model to a more bottom-up model where there's consensus building from the ground up rather than, and I don't even mean ground, I mean from the circumference of the team inward. But you have a long history of educators being treated as revenue centers. You have a long history of curators being treated as knowledge hoarders. A long history of disrespect within cultural organizations and siloing. And I think the task is to lift them all up and encourage parallel questioning, parallel programming, like the kind of thing that you're talking about. This just opens up possibility for colleagues to explore different forms of exhibition making. But with more imagination and openness, I think we'll be able to find ways that publics can identify points of entry into us rather than the constant drive of outreach, which is taxing staff because they can't do it. They don't know how. And it might not work.
For some reason, this makes me think of social media. Because the museum, we're trying to get better at it and trying to develop our voice. I don't think we're there yet. But it's just something that I think about and question, how much should we invest in the social media content creation? If we're this museum that is like rooted in this neighborhood, and we have a building now, and we don't have a lot of staff capacity to create and generate this new content. And it's, I think, indicative of institutional anxiety and kind of neuroticism about, whether we're relevant, I guess, to go back to your essay. And I feel like relevance in the world of social media means, you can sort of quantify it. You can tell whether, you think it's really hitting or not, what you're posting. And yeah, I think with social media also, there's a kind of discourse there that you can really get wrapped up in, and as a museum, we can't get too wrapped up in it, and then so if you're not willing to do that, I feel like you don't really have a voice in social media either. So, yeah, I don't know what made me think about this, but it's just probably just always on my mind too, because like there's a kind of institutional kind of will towards creating better, social media content, and I'm like, I don't know, I come from like exit art, alternative art spaces, that kind of like vibe, and I'm not really like that good on social media for myself either. My favorite museum experiences are ones where there aren't that many people around, like I'm alone in a gallery with some artwork I have like a lot of questions about. There's like, I like reading the wall text, so I read it. I like, and I like to just, space out in front of like artwork or whatever the curator has put in front of us, even if it's like not, to me, that great. And it's not social media. It's not like interactive things usually. Although like at the museum, like I try to incorporate interactive things because, it's like a fun problem-solving exercise for me, and it's also like, I feel like people do want that, and if you do it right, it sort of makes people stick around a little bit longer in your exhibition, which is, I think, a good thing. So, I don't know, museums is just this space now that I feel like a lot of people think can be anything, and it can do almost anything. It can do like mutual aid. It can, during the pandemic, should we distribute food? Should we be a place to, offer healthcare, resources? The Queens Museum, they, during the Black Lives Matter movement, like they opened up their space and had like art supplies, and you can make signs to go out and protest with. And I'm like, this is all really cool. It's all like great to open up the museum like that. But sometimes I question like how far we can go with it before we, stop being like the kind of museum that I myself would want to like, participate in.
Yeah, we're not social service providers, right? We don't save lives, we affirm creativity. We have the capacity and expertise to make these affirmations of life and relationship. And it feels like just relevance, or social media like relevance, just tells us what's supposed to matter, not what really does. And what really does is Sheldon's exhibition, the subject matter of Sheldon's exhibition, because it is very much about survival from the perspective of people who have developed survival skills and shared survival skills, right? And that means something. That feels, if anything, is that we've talked about today is relevant. It's that, but it's an exhibition that does. It's not just an exhibition about something.
Yeah, and that point of doing, something that I've learned in this process is the necessity for sort of exhibitions of such gravity to have a sense of activity, be this really active nature to them. And Tina, you were speaking about it existing as like an active harm reduction site to some degree, and I think for those who haven't seen the show yet, I guess what you're referencing is actually our sort of resource table in the middle of the exhibition that has Narcan kits as well as fentanyl test strips, condoms, and more, to the point that we actually cannot keep them stocked so often because of the demand for them. And actually, to sort of echo your statement to some degree, in a former professional context, I, in response to the proposition of staff Narcan trainings, somebody on a leadership team at another organization had stated, we are a museum, not a community center. And while I do not disagree with the sort of literal terms used there, I do at times, depending on the context, find such a statement to be a bit fraught in a way in how it really sort of ignores to a degree the way that museums do serve as can serve as connective tissues between social services, civic organizations, in context of their programming, in context of art, right? And that we don't just have to resign ourselves to a singular space or a singular role, but that we have the benefit and the privilege of trusted community space and can utilize that to serve as a space for the exchange of cultural capital, educational expertise, and quite literal material resources such as all of these sort of drug harm reduction resources on the table downstairs.
And that's the 20-year difference between, not the 50-year difference that will blow my mind later. But yeah, I got you. I hear what you're saying.
Thank you guys so much. Let's continue that work downstairs. Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you.